Thanks. Hello. Hello. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hi, Mark. Mark says, with everything I read from him, I fall further in admiration and respect of Nathan Tankus. Yes, the older he gets, the better he gets. I agree. And Tim Canova says John Kenneth Galbraith was wrong about countervailing powers. Yes. Yes, I think he was. He was. Well, when he wrote, there were some countervailing powers. But I think right now we're tending far more to the view of society held by C. Wright Mills. Hey, Tim, how are you? Glad to see you here. Hi, Steve Day. How you doing? Hi, Stacy. How are you? Hi, Mark. Kay and Dolores, I've already said hi to you. So thank you all for coming. Tonight, what I wanted to talk about was what I'd like to talk about tonight is really the general trend of things since Bernie Sanders, rather inexcusably, I think, decided to bow out of the presidential race too early. When he basically admitted defeat, of course, he called on the revolution to continue. But of course, when you have a revolution that's been self-organizing around a particular leader, there's bound to be a little bit of a depression, and there's bound to be some disorganization while the forces in back of a revolution find a new leadership structure. And we have to remember that the campaign essentially met with the self-organizing revolution and then imposed a superstructure on that particular revolution. And not all of the people who were prominent in the superstructure were actually for the revolution. For them, it was just a gig that they were going to be involved in for a time while they earned a living for their families. Of course, they believed in the gig or in the movement behind the gig to some degree, but I think they kind of believed in it as something that was there to back them and to serve them, and not something that was there as a larger and very essential thing for the United States and perhaps for the world at this time. So, of course, we have the pandemic. And part of why Bernie got out of the race, it seems to me, was because of the pandemic. And I think what particularly was hurting him at that time was not only the defeats, but also the fact that his style of campaigning had to be shut down on pain of his being a factor in the deaths of people who might continue to come out for him in the midst of the pandemic, when the country, of course, needed to shut down. I think that was a big thing weighing on Bernie's conscience, on his mind, was a big factor in his decision to get out. I still believe, though, that his withdrawal was extremely premature, and that it is meant that he's no longer in a position to lead the revolution that he did so much to start. There are many of us who have had it with him, while granting, of course, that he was very important in getting things started and being grateful to him. I think there are very many of us now who are not sufficiently grateful to him to follow him into the where the Democratic Party is currently attempting to force him to go. We are not going there, and we resent the efforts of the party to force us there. And what the party seems to be doing right now is to just shrink us down, as much as it can. And nowhere do we see this more than in the response of the party in Congress and in the response of the presidential campaign. But I don't know if I want to extend it fully to the presidential campaign, okay, of Joe Biden, though I think that's certainly an element there. But I think the response in Congress, the response of the party in Congress, seems to be to ignore the advice of what people on the progressive side are suggesting, and instead to go with the same old neoliberal formulas in creating a response to the pandemic. Okay. So I want to start off today with an article by Rowan Gray, actually, that he published in The Nation some time ago on March 20th, which seems like an awfully long time ago, but I think that article had some very, very good things to say about what had to be done about the crisis. And I think that Nathan's writings at that time and since, but Nathan Tankes's writings at that time, okay, and since, have much the same perspective as Rowan in this earlier article. So I'm going to share that with you now, and we will go through it, and I'll comment on it. Of course, I have a lot in common with the perspectives of this article, okay, as well. And so I want to share that with you now. And you should have it up on your screens right now. You should be seeing an ad for The Nation. I'm sorry about that. But yes, I see that it's showing on your screen. So let me get back to it and go over it with you. Okay. Oh, I trust that my sound is okay tonight. I'm just sort of taking that for granted. I think I've solved the sound problems and also the technical problems I was having with my camera. Everything seems to be rock solid now, but increasingly rock solid each time that I go on. Is there a Matt here? Which Matt is here? Is it maybe Matt Waldy? Okay, so Rowan is about teaching people that we can afford to beat this particular crisis, or beat the economic aspect of the crisis anyway. Well, both the economic and the pandemic aspects of the crisis. But, okay, anyway, we'll go through The Nation's various commercials here. And Rowan points out that during the presidential primary debate this past Sunday, Joe Biden was asked how he would respond to the coronavirus pandemic sweeping the world. And his response was, nobody will pay for anything having to do with the crisis. This is a national emergency. There isn't a question of whether or not this is something that could be covered by insurance or anything else. We, out of the Treasury, are going to pay for this. And Rowan correctly points out this was a noticeable rhetorical shift for Joe Biden. Haven't heard much about that particular rhetorical shift since that time. I don't know how much he's been coherent since that time, but anyway, who has spent the entire primary season attacking his opponent, Bernie Sanders, for not adequately explaining how Bernie would pay for, quote unquote, his ambitious spending proposals, and who only days ago indicated that as president, he would veto legislation enacting Medicare for all because of concern over the price tag. Indeed, Joe Biden has been a proud deficit hawk his entire career, says Rowan. And he has. Much too proud a deficit hawk, if you ask me. As a senator, he broke with his own party to support a Republican-sponsored balanced budget amendment. We haven't heard much about that from him lately, but wait for it to arise, okay, at any time. I'm sure he still has balanced budget stuff in his DNA. And as vice president, he spearheaded efforts to achieve a bipartisan deficit reduction deal that included cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Yes, I remember his efforts to do that in 2011, 2012, 2013, and going forward. He always seemed to be trying to do a deal with the Republicans to reduce the deficits and to do this through cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And we never made clear how the deficit was going to be reduced to cuts, by making cuts to Medicare and Social Security, which, of course, had not been the cause of the deficits in the first place. There's an article by Naomi Klein being advertised, or it's a video, I guess. The ease with which Biden switched from how he can afford it to how he can afford not to underscores the important fact, long forgotten by most politicians and the public. When faced with a genuine prospect of annihilation, the only adequate response is to do whatever it takes to prevent it. For the U.S. government, that means not asking how will we find the money, but instead how will we find and mobilize the necessary real resources. Now, this is, this last is a golden rule, of MMT, that it's never really about the money. It's really about finding and using the money to mobilize the necessary real resources. But it's never about having enough money, because a monetary sovereign, such as the United States, can always decide to have enough money because it has the capability to create whatever money it needs to pay for whatever it needs that's on sale in return for its own currency. So Rowan makes clear that the current pandemic rivals only World War II and in its sheer scale and scope of disruption. But he points out that the monetary policy paradigm we have right now is already under strain, that it's now at its breaking point, that in the last week, the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates, he's talking back in March, of course, revived the long stigmatized discount window, introduced a new commercial paper and municipal bond facility, and increased currency swap line support to other countries. And he says these actions are unlikely to make much of a dent. The previously unthinkable, massive, open-ended deficit spending is now a near inevitability. And yes, that seemed to be the case. And of course, we had the CARES Act, and we've had other spending since then. And then also Nancy Pelosi passed a bill in the House that called for another $4 trillion in spending. But of course, as she was doing that, the Republicans started the deficit hawk song again, talking about how we had to be concerned about fiscal responsibility and reducing the deficit, and that, of course, hadn't we already spent enough, which for them actually meant the $4.6 trillion trust fund slush fund that, along with the Federal Reserve, they created for extremely large businesses, as well as the Paycheck Protection Program, which they designed in such a way that large corporations would be able to loot it, even though it was ostensibly designed to help small businesses. But you know how I feel about that. In the aftermath, continuing with Rowan, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the Obama administration allowed millions to lose their homes in order to, quote, foam the runways, unquote, for the banking system, while the Republicans cynically weaponized deficit and debt hysteria in order to deny the Democrats the political credit of a more successful recovery. Today, by contrast, there's bipartisan support there's bipartisan enthusiasm for support measures that target workers and families, including debt relief and direct cash assistance. At the same time, there are prominent progressives, including Bernie Sanders and the Squad, as well as Republican establishment figures like Mitt Romney and far-right populists like Tom Cotton, who criticized party leadership for not going far enough. That it is even imaginable to speak of a common policy agenda between leftists, moderates, and the extreme right wing, let alone one centered around a government spending spree, speaks to just how devastating an inadequate response to this moment would be for everyone. I think that was overly optimistic statement, by Rowan, but as we go forward now, we may come again to that in a little while because people are going to get worried about their Senate seats, probably are a bit worried now, and they're going to get worried about the likely outcome of the election in the fall very, very soon as we approach that particular election and as the hopes for a fairy tale recovery by the Republicans tend to fade. But anyway, as we go forward, however, this crisis also underscores another truth that only the left is willing to acknowledge and confront. The coronavirus is a tragedy, not because the intense suffering it will cause is so exceptional, but because it isn't. I thought that was very insightful of Rowan to point that out. Every year, millions of people die preventable deaths, that their proximate causes, gun violence, domestic abuse, racist policing, inadequate health care, militarized border enforcement, international economic sanctions, war-induced starvation, cannot be directly traced back to the particular genomic structure of COVID-19 is of little solace to the victims or their loved ones. Indeed, much of the suffering attributable to this pandemic will not come from people directly contracting the virus, but from our collective failure to provide adequate care and support to the elderly, the physically vulnerable, the poor, and people in less fortunate countries during the hour of need. The virus itself may be a novel twist, but the broader story is regrettably all too familiar. And then he goes on to point out that while it's tempting to downplay the moment we're in as a temporary emergency, though this seems to be the Republican view of it, at least from some of the Republicans, the reality is that our present situation is much closer to the new normal than a state of exception. We're only now coming to appreciate just how truly interconnected we all are. Both in terms of our mental interconnections, thanks to social media, common culture, and the internet, and physically, thanks to global supply chains, immigration, and of course, the environment. The macrophysics of global heating, like the microbiology of the coronavirus, doesn't care about our legal borders, economic theories, or political beliefs. Nature is the great leveler, humbling the smallest country and greatest empire alike. Even Biden knows this, which is why on Sunday he acknowledged that upon entering office in 2009, he and President Obama were informed by the Department of Defense that climate change was the single greatest threat to American national security, a point Bernie Sanders has been making for years. However, when the moderators pointed out that his climate plan was $14 trillion less than Bernie's, over 10 years, of course, he retreated into defensive bluster and nostalgic promises to restore the 2016 Paris Agreement, Gone was the sense of existential urgency and ambition that had animated his earlier remarks about the coronavirus. Such hypocrisy from someone aspiring to the office of President of the United States is morally and practically unacceptable, though we have had such a surfeit of that kind of hypocrisy over the last 20, 30, 40 years. It's all been morally and practically unacceptable. Anyway, Rohn goes on. He says, in a free society, we are all Spartacus. I think that was very nicely put. And in a human society, all existential threats to someone, anyone, are the coronavirus. Poverty, sickness, the climate crisis, and structural racism are all national emergencies. But get our legislature, get our leaders to accept that they're all national emergencies. That's the problem. We haven't been able to do that. But going on with what Rowan says, and all deserve the same commitment, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes means fundamentally reforming our monetary and financial system so that we can easily and quickly provide income to everyone when necessary without sacrificing anyone's privacy or civil liberties. It also means transitioning away from fossil fuels and enacting a Green New Deal undergirded by the right to a well-paying job so that everyone has the opportunity to contribute to the common cause of caring for people, communities, and planet, and creating public goods that are available free to everyone. And yes, whatever it takes means embracing the inevitability of a head-on conflict with the self-interest of concentrated private capital. Now that's something, Rowan, that I don't think that Biden has embraced or accepted. We see no evidence of any acceptance of that. Anyway, a few months ago, it would have sounded extreme to propose placing Amazon, Walmart, Netflix, Uber, and American Airlines under public ownership. But today, the socially contingent nature of these corporate behemoths, from their financial engine to their workforce to the goods and services they provide, has been laid bare. If luxury perfume companies like Christian Dior and Givenchy can be repurposed to make hand sanitizer to save lives, surely we can consider the same for the companies responsible for essential basic staples such as food, ventilators, and toilet paper as well. For myself, I prefer the CPAP, but those machines to ventilators. Almost no one seems to survive going on a ventilator, but I digress. We want clean hands, but we also want bread, roses, and the means to wipe our asses. Very well put by Rowan, I thought. In the 1970s, oh, by the way, after about 5 weeks of looking, I was able to find only some Charmin recently at a Costco in this area. All I have to say about Charmin is it's extremely thick toilet paper. In the 1970s, during her struggle to enact the job guarantee and complete the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, Coretta Scott King observed that the United States had, quote, never honestly dealt with the question of a peacetime economy. She is still correct. Even now, we're willing to mobilize. By the way, this is a brilliant article, isn't it? We are willing to mobilize against the coronavirus only because its form sufficiently resembles that of a foreign invader. But the real enemy, the one we have always been at war against, is the violence and despair of our own timidity, selfishness, and greed. For too long, we have responded to this enemy with appeasement. But appeasement has proven to be a losing strategy, as indeed it always is. The only way we will have any chance of overcoming the challenge of our present moment is by bringing everyone together, emphasizing our common cause, and committing to building institutions that reflect and reinforce basic notions of universal solidarity. If we do that, as a wise old man once said, there's nothing we can't accomplish. And then there's a correction. The previous version of this article incorrectly stated that Joe Biden's climate plan was 1/14th the size of Bernie Sanders' plan. It is actually about 1/8 of the size, or $14 trillion less than Sanders's climate plan. Yes, it was roughly 2 trillion as opposed to 1 trillion. I think it was Elizabeth Warren who had the 1 trillion plan, wasn't it? It was one of them who had a 1 trillion plan. Anyway, so this article is saying, whatever it takes, okay, to get out of this, to handle all of the emergencies, not just the coronavirus emergency, but all the structural emergencies, the poverty, the sickness, the climate crisis, the structural racism, all national emergencies, and they all are. And Erwin's told us what is needed and assured us that there is no monetary problem here. It's about actually mobilizing the real resources. So let us leave this one and go to the second article that I wanted to go through with you. And this one is by Nathan Tankis. And he published it on his blog, which is substack.com. But I picked it up, even though I very often look at Substack. In this case, I picked this up from Naked Capitalism. And so, where I used to write a lot, actually myself, but anyway, Nathan's blog, published on May 27th, that's today. What are the three concurrent crises of the coronavirus on the depression? We've talked enough about the depression to indicate that we certainly believe that it is a depression. Okay, Eve Smith starts off with a little introduction. Like many of those who are taking this crisis or crises seriously, Nathan Tankis has proposed launching new government programs as a way to tackle specific problems created by the crisis. While this is eminently logical as well as sound, don't expect anything like that to happen. As political economist Tom Ferguson pointed out in a presentation we discussed today, the U.S. and most other advanced economies are taking a neoliberal approach, channeling money and aid through existing institutions, too often private. Yes, exactly, that is the problem, and it is, of course, the heart of a neoliberal approach. So Nathan, referring to his newsletter, says, in the first month of this newsletter, his blog on Substack, I wrote a lot more big picture pieces about the nature of our current crisis. The last major piece I wrote on this topic was, quote, how to pay for the pandemic war. My view hasn't changed much, but it's always worth reiterating and restating it in new ways what our major problems are in order to conceptualize how to deal with them. One way to think about this crisis is it's really three interrelated crises happening all at once. An interesting way to frame these crises is to differentiate them by the economists who focused on their unique problems. And then he says, in true academic fashion, we will take them in turn. The Keynes crisis. This crisis and its association with Keynes is the most obvious and straightforward. And he points out that Keynes was renowned as an economic theorist. He refers to the general theory of employment, interest, and money, and says Keynes showed there are no automatic processes operating in the private sector to return economies to full employment. And in fact, they can sustain large degrees of unemployment for significant periods of time. He referred to this as an unemployment equilibrium. While the book itself actually spends very little time on government spending, the obvious conclusion of his work was that government spending had the power to increase incomes and employment, and thus could deal with shortages of demand. Okay, by the way, when Keynes wrote his book, while the United States had created a limited form of monetary sovereignty by getting rid of the gold standard in the domestic economy, when FDR closed the gold window in 1933, at the time he published his great work, the U.S. was still on the gold standard in the area of international trade. So it did not have full control of its currency at that time, and would not have it until it was willing to get off the gold standard, which did not happen until 1971. This lesson, hard learned and easily forgotten, remains as relevant today as when it was first taught during the Great Depression. It remained relevant a decade ago to the Great Financial Crisis. We have a grievous lack of demand today, especially for labor. The most obvious and straightforward way to increase demand is through government spending and grants. It can be hard for analysts to really focus on this aspect of the crisis because it is relatively analytically uninteresting. What needs to happen is painfully clear to everyone but Donald Trump, congressional leadership, and the most ideological of economists. The only analytically interesting point regarding the nature of this crisis as a demand crisis is that despite the disruption to production, the demand effects are much more important and foundational, notwithstanding the difficulty that intellectually solved problems have for holding the attention of analysts. This point needs to be pressed again and again. We have a demand problem. The most persistent and problematic effects of a collapse in demand is the social and skill effects on workers. Thus, a policy to increase demand should focus on direct employment of labor. The problem needs to be responded to, and the answer for how much to spend is whatever it takes. And there's the link to Rowan's piece that we just finished. Now, the second of the three crises is the Minsky crisis. He says that is distinct from the Keynes crisis, but related to it. And he points out Hyman Minsky was a mid to late 20th century economist who built his work on top of Keynes and a number of other economists who were quickly ejected from the mainstream conversation, as was Minsky. His work grounded concerns about overall demand and demand for labor in balance sheets and cash flows between economic actors. He focused his gaze on the causes of financial crises, which he correctly saw as distinct from demand problems. What's important about his work now is that it teaches us the most urgent problem of the sudden, utter, and complete collapse of payments, which has happened in the past few months, is the corresponding collapse in cash flows. Okay, and Nathan might have said also sales, and the threat of a wave of defaults and bankruptcies, especially as the production of services can't be safely restarted, and certainly not at its previous level. The immediate cash flow problem can't be solved by increasing demand. As a result, businesses must be given direct grants from the federal government. The Small Business Association's Payroll Protection Plan is meant to do that. As I've discussed at length However, he should have said the Small Business Administration's Payroll Protection Program, the SBA, is meant to do that. As I've discussed at length, however, it has a number of problems. My alternative proposal is an emergency basic income for all businesses. I think that's a great proposal, by the way. I love that proposal. Small businesses surely need that. And he links us to one of his pieces on Substack called Why Don't We Just Provide, and probably says, why don't we just provide? I still can't see it. It's blocked out by my sharing thing on the screen. But it probably says we just need a basic income. Or why don't we just do a basic income for all small businesses? Dealing with the cash flow problems in this manner can also help to relieve the Keynes crisis by maintaining and or increasing the business demand for labor, in addition to the business cash flow problem. There's also the cash flow problem of households. Providing them with direct cash payments is critical, as is extending the supplementary unemployment insurance. In this respect, it's encouraging the Treasury is now providing unbanked and underbanked people access to their $1,200 payments with debit cards. If there is another stimulus payment, I hope the Treasury Department does that as well for people who are banked. Anyway, hopefully this will be expanded and improved upon in the weeks and months to come. Of course, state and local governments also need basic incomes, and the safety net needs to be further nationalized. There is no reason that the monetary burden of unemployment insurance should be placed on state governments. Then the third crisis, Nathan calls the means crisis, named after Gardner Means. The economist that this type of crisis named after may be the most obscure one on this list. Gardner Means is one of the most important economists within the New Deal. Yes, I remember him from my younger days because he was still important during the 1950s when I became somewhat conscious, of economics, and even during the 1960s. First, at the Agricultural Adjustment Administration within the Agriculture Department, then in other positions throughout the government, he theorized both the causes of the Great Depression and the ways of remedying it by using monetary policy, fiscal policy, and planning. Gardner Means was for planning. One of his most notable positions was with the National Resources Planning Board, which we had, of course, in World War II. He rejected the idea that there was a price mechanism that allocated physical resources to different uses which functioned in the American economy. Instead, he argued that prices were administered by industrial businesses. This was an argument also made by J.K. Galbraith, that is John Kenneth Galbraith, in other words, Galbraith the Elder, from our point of view. He argued that prices were administered by industrial businesses, especially the largest corporations. Instead of prices allocating resources, it was the direct resource and spending decisions of businesses and governments which directed them. Why did Means say that? Because he fully understood that the large corporations, through their allocation of physical resources, were administering prices in the economy, that it was places like General Motors and Ford and U.S. Steel that were actually determining prices along with the federal government, and that small farmers didn't have much to say about prices because there were still some segments of the economy, like the farm sector, that were governed, at least in some part, by a market economy. But Gardner Means and other economists at the time, okay, including Galbraith, actually recognized that by the end of the 1950s, there wasn't much of a market economy still left. Instead of prices allocating resources, it was the direct resource and spending decisions of businesses and governments which directed them. The means crisis is thus the crisis of the physical allocation of resources between different uses. To respond to it, we need to bring back the notion of resource planning and the regulation of supply chains. Bullseye. To respond to it, we need to bring back the notion of resource planning and the regulation of supply chains. Exactly what we need now, exactly what Donald Trump will not do, exactly what the neoliberals on the Democratic side also don't want to do. The idea of resource planning has been severely out of fashion for decades, but it's hard to imagine it not making a comeback because of the coronavirus depression. It is hard to imagine, but maybe not so hard. It depends upon who wins in the current election, and it also depends upon whether the Democratic Party can be pushed and pressured and mauled and pulled and twisted into remembering its past. It has to remember its past, and it has to remember that it cannot be a neoliberal party anymore. But what Nathan says, if it somehow doesn't revive in this crisis, the climate crisis will surely revive it. Let's hope this is true before the climate crisis is irretrievable for us. Remember, we have only 10 years. We have only 10 years. Some folks say 12, but 10 or 12. We're currently far from the legislature, far from the government, understanding that to respond to the crisis, we need to bring back the notion of resource planning and the regulation of supply chains. The MMTers know this, and it's significant to understand that the MMT economists have taught over the years, both Rowan Gray and also Nathan Tankus, who have now joined their ranks. So you're looking at the kinds of policies that MMT economists would produce at present, at least the kinds of policy views and policy advice. What his work teaches us now, going back to Gardner Means, is we can't rely on prices to reallocate resources. Existing prices and existing patterns of production and consumption can be sustained relatively easily by private action. However, profit-seeking businesses are bad at reallocating resources in response to crises. The uncertainty of how long the crisis will last and whether the costs of retooling plants and restructuring supply chains can be recouped discourages bold action. It is often perceived to be cheaper to simply leave productive resources unused than go through such expenses and uncertainties. Even farms are letting crops rot and euthanizing animals rather than trying to find ways to reorganize their supply chains. What Means work teaches us is that the government should step into this breach. It should be directly, physically reallocating resources and organizing production through hiring workers and guaranteeing private producers' markets. Resources left unplanned are predictably unorganized. Private sector planning works at dealing with medium and long-term resource questions, but struggles to move quickly and effectively in times of crisis. In fact, cannot move quickly and effectively in times of crisis, as we've been seeing in every big crisis that we've gotten over a very long time now. I don't know why we tolerate that any longer. I don't know why we accept the myths that private sector planning and private sector functioning are somehow better for the economy. They're better for those at the top who benefit, but they're not better for the 99%. By now, that must be clear to us already, just by virtue of the fact that we now divide things into the 1% and the 99%. Moving to the conclusion. One key ingredient in the policy mix which responds to this crisis should be, quote, an emergency responder corps, unquote. As it happens, Representative Rashida Tlaib has made just such a proposal. And he has a link to the appeal.org and the proposal by Rashida. Such a labor force could help respond to all three crises at once. It could be mobilized to facilitate the reallocation of resources, especially their delivery directly to those who need it most. It would provide many households who are now facing unemployment with an income and thus a cash flow with job guarantee. This won't be a cure-all. We still need the suite of policy programs I described above. This crisis can be managed far better than it is currently being managed. It is impossible to avoid pain, both medical and economic, at this late date. However, we can relieve the worst symptoms and put our economy on the road to permanent resource planning that we don't ever have to be caught as unprepared ever again. These three concurrent crises have lessons we badly need to learn in order to deal with the next crisis, the climate crisis. I think this is very interesting that Nathan puts these three crises in the form of crises that were identified by three economists. But we also have to recognize that these crises are, well, there's more than three crises here. There's a crisis of justice. There's a crisis of public health. And there is the crisis of the neoliberal form, of economics, which by now either must be in its death throes or we will be in our death throes. So this is another triple crisis. The crisis, of neoliberal economics is not really a crisis of economics at all. It's actually a crisis, of neoliberalism as a political economic movement. The fact that we have to move out of the political economy of neoliberalism and move into an alternative political economy of democratic socialism. And I think by now that should be apparent to all of us, though I don't know whether it should be called a political economy of democratic socialism, simply because I don't think that there are agreed upon definitions of that particular term today. What we're really talking about, is an economy that has no bias towards either the private sector or the government, but allows government programs to fulfill their public purpose functions to the utmost. And those public purpose functions include taking on the jobs that are best done by the government and leaving the jobs that are best done by the private sector to the private sector. And that has not been going on now for a very long time. There's been a terrible bias in favor of the private sector and an insistence on public-private partnerships where the private always benefits and where the public always seems to lose out. the form, okay, of lemon socialism. That is certainly lemon socialism. Uh, what we need is this new alternative form of economy looking for a name, since I'm saying perhaps a good name is not a democratic socialism, because that evokes too much of an at times very unhappy history in certain countries, even though it also evokes uh, a very happy country in certain other, a very happy form of government, okay, in other countries. But it's too much of a mixed bag. I think we need a name that doesn't have perhaps quite so much of a history. Okay. But now, so you see, this is the way the progressives are thinking. The kinds of thinking being done by Rowan Gray and by Nathan Tankus and by a number of others of us in our writings, okay, and our live streams. This is the kind of thinking that we're doing. These are the kinds of programs we want. But now the question and the point of this live stream comes up in a third article. After the concession, okay, of Bernie Sanders, what are the Democrats doing in terms of how they are responding to this crisis? Are they trying to respond to this crisis in the most effective way, or are they trying to respond to this crisis in a neoliberal way that strengthens the power of the dead ideology of neoliberalism, and that tries to rekindle the vigor of a failed ideology that is itself, that was responsible for the recession of 2009, the following years, the very slow recovery since then, and that now is responsible for the depth of the pandemic crisis. Remember, just yesterday, I went through a live stream focusing on the contrasting record of different nations in relation to the success of those nations in fighting the pandemic. And I made it apparent that some nations have been ridiculously successful. The 24 million people in Taiwan, the 51 million people in South Korea, the 28 million people in Australia, the 4.5 million people in New Zealand. I think very likely, in spite of suspicion over their numbers and statistics, the 1.4 billion people in China. Because remember, after looking at the Taiwan numbers, after looking at the Hong Kong numbers, do any of us really believe that mainland China, following the kind of strategy it did to contain the virus, does anybody really think that it did not have the same order of success as the other countries I mentioned? I seriously doubt it. I understand why people are skeptical of the Chinese numbers. I'm skeptical myself to a degree, but I am not tenfold skeptical. I don't think that they had 823,000 cases in China. I don't think that they had 85,000 fatalities in China, or 40,000, or 30,000. I think their fatalities are on the order of what they reported, and that they have been enormously successful in handling the pandemic compared with ourselves, and probably enormously successful in handling their economy too. Anyway, the last article I wanted to go through with you was by David Sirota. It was published in The Guardian on the 26th of May, and the title is Democrats Are Fueling a Corporate Counter-Revolution Against the Progressives. And the subtitle, Democrats in Washington are not just passively failing to mount an opposition to Trump, they're actively helping Republicans. And there she is, Ms. Plastic, designer ice cream of 2020 herself, Nancy Pelosi. These are bleak days for America's progressive movement. The Democratic primary process handed the party's nomination to the candidate with the most conservative record. Corporate-friendly politicians like the New York Governor Andrew Cuomo are using the pandemic to brandish their images and install billionaires to run things. And progressive lawmakers in Congress are being steamrolled, even by their own party's leadership, and a recession is battering the state and local budgets that fund the priorities of the progressives, like education and the social safety net. Perhaps this is a temporary stall out, a fleeting moment of retreat, and a 2 steps forward, 1 step back trajectory. After all, polls continue to show that from workers' rights to universal health care, a majority of Americans support a progressive policy agenda. The problem, though, is that Democrats in Washington are not just passively failing to mount a strong opposition to Donald Trump, they're actively helping Republicans try to fortify the obstacles to long-term progressive change well after this emergency subsides. This corporate counter-revolution is easiest to see in Democrats' enthusiastic support for Republicans' legislative response to the coronavirus crisis. But Democrats' entire 2018 electoral campaign told America that the opposition party needed to win back Congress in order to block Trump's regressive agenda. And yet, when the Republicans proposed a bill to let Trump's appointees dole out government cash to their corporate allies with no strings attached, this same opposition party mustered not a single recorded vote against the package, not one. Yes, we gave the Democrats what they wanted in 2018. They told us they needed to win back Congress in order to block Trump's regressive agenda. They did. And we gave them that. We gave them a huge victory in the House. A huge reversal of fortunes in the House. Almost as big a victory as they had in 2008. And yet, when the Republicans proposed a bill to let Trump's appointees dole out government cash to their corporate allies with no strings attached, this same opposition party mustered not a single recorded vote against the package, not one. They were not even as much in opposition to the Republicans as they were when they were elected in 2007. They were more of an opposition party then than they are now. And David Sirota says, thanks to that, Trump appointees and the Federal Reserve can now hand out $4.6 trillion, David. But what's 600 billion between friends, right? The politically connected corporations as they lay waste to our economy and steamroll progressive reforms. That's the money cannon we've been talking about, folks. Private equity firms and fossil fuel companies get new tax breaks as they buy elections and try to lock in permanent climate change. Yes, the bailout has empowered the private equity firms and the fossil fuel companies, and not only the banks and the financial companies. These bailouts were part of a larger legislative package that included good things like expanded unemployment benefits. And so you could argue Democrats simply had to swallow a bitter pill and vote yes. I would not argue that. They should have voted no. And they should have said no bailouts for the corporates until there's a full bailout for the people. We will entertain a bailout for corporations that really need it, that are really suffering, like the airlines. We will pass that, but we won't pass any bailouts for any other firms that are solid financially, or that are not necessary for the coming global economy based on non-fossil fuels. We will not entertain anything for those until after you vote for a full bailout for the small businesses and the people of America. That's the message that should have been delivered by an opposition Democratic Party rather than by a faux resistance party more interested in designer ice cream than they are in passing good policies for the people. And so you could argue that Democrats simply had to swallow a bitter pill and vote yes, except they subsequently proposed their own standalone legislation that would further strengthen the corporate opponents of progressive reform. For example, there's the Democrats' push to alter the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. Those programs were designed to help employees of mom-and-pop enterprises throughout the country. I would argue they were not really designed, to do that. That was their stated intention in the bill. Unfortunately, the trouble was the bill wasn't really designed to help the employees of the mom and pop enterprises. It seems to have really been designed so that big corporations could gobble up large parts of the largesse that were being dispensed. House Democrats' new stimulus legislation would open up the small business lending program to what they call small nonprofits, but their language was crafted to provide the forgivable loans to industry trade associations. Yes, just so. Those lobby groups represent the planet's biggest corporations, and their political action committees have delivered more than $191 million of campaign cash to lawmakers in the last 2 decades. So, of course, why don't we pass a program, says Nancy Pelosi, to give them the $191 million back right now? Then they'll have another $191 million they can give us. And maybe they'll give us that $191 million over 2 years. What about that? Maybe that's what Nancy Pelosi was thinking. Anyway, Democrats have pitched their legislation as a message bill that declares their values. And in this case, they're reassuring Washington power players that money meant for workers at neighborhood restaurants, local shops, and other mom-and-pop concerns can be raided by the front groups representing giant drug companies, health insurers, and Wall Street firms. If the legislation passes, it would not merely be an epic tale of greed. The new funding stream for corporate lobbying groups would bolster the very forces that make sure federal policy disempowers workers, maximizes private profit, and generally protects the ruling class. Exactly what Nancy Pelosi wanted to do. Why? Because she exemplifies the ruling class. It's an even worse story on health care, as 43 million Americans face the prospect of losing private health insurance. Democrats had a huge opportunity after Trump himself suggested he wanted the government to pay healthcare providers directly for treating uninsured COVID 19 patients. They could have called his bluff and passed existing legislation to expand the Medicare program existing from Bernie Sanders, by the way, to expand the Medicare program that provides actual medical care. Instead, House Democrats passed a bill to support lightly regulated private insurance marketplaces and to subsidize existing private insurance plans through a Rube Goldberg machine known as COBRA. Yeah, I got it right this time. I kept saying Corba, which is an IT networking shtick, but it is Cobra. And they passed this giveaway just after receiving an infusion of campaign cash collected by insurance lobbyists. Taken together, these initiatives would route yet more public money through a corporate insurance bureaucracy in hopes that medical care eventually trickles down to Americans who desperately need it. Such a system is totally inadequate during the pandemic, doesn't guarantee health care, it only guarantees insurance coverage, which is so often denied or restricted when a medical claim is actually filed. Moreover, corporate health insurance has far higher administrative costs than single payer programs like the Medicare program, and even the much vaunted Affordable Care Act allows insurers to siphon up to 20% of customers' premiums to corporate profits rather than to actual medical care. But then Democrats' COBRA program is not merely a financial bailout for insurers. It's also a political bailout when the industry needs it most, at a time when popular support for Medicare for All is surging, when even a Republican president feels the need to make rhetorical, if empty, gestures toward the concept of government-funded health care. The COBRA plan would use public money to firm up the private health insurance industry's dominance over the healthcare system just in time to short-circuit a Medicare expansion. Yes, but also, that's what the COBRA plan would do. But also the plan to siphon off what's supposed to be small business funding to the lobby groups, some of whom are the private health insurance lobby groups. Some of that money would be going to them so that they could be financially fueled from the government in their fight against Medicare for all. Okay. In other words, part of Nancy Pelosi's plan was to get the government money flowing through to the health insurance lobbies, which would represent the industry, to make her prophecy that we would never get a Medicare for All program for the rest of us to come true by strengthening the very lobbying forces that have been seeing to it for so long that we never do get Medicare for All. That was the diabolical design of the HEROES Act. It was going to bail out the private health insurance industry, and it was going to bail out the lobbies for the private health insurance industry. So we would never get Medicare for All. That's why the most important thing we can probably do in this election cycle when it comes to Congress is seeing to it that Nancy Pelosi's career is ended once and for all through extensive support to Shahed Buttar. That is the most important race in the country at this point. The most important race in the country from the progressive point of view. Now, it may be that within the coming months, that the actions of both the Republicans and the Democrats, the terrible, ineffective actions of both parties, will, against all odds, cause a third party presidential candidate to rise who has a chance to win, then that might become the most important race in the country. But for now, the most important race of the country may be the one that gets rid of Nancy Pelosi once and for all. And that gives the progressive forces in Congress a boost to get someone they can work with, who will not always and everywhere betray the progressive initiatives going on. That's probably why insurance companies have been lobbying for it. They know that such a program would boost their short-term profits, and they know that once such a program is in place, it would be politically difficult to get it repealed and replaced by progressives' far better Medicare for All program. In other words, the Democrats' COBRA plan may secure insurance companies' profit-skimming position between Americans and their healthcare providers for decades to come, if Pelosi gets away and Medicare for All is never passed. If you get the sense that the fix is in and this is all deliberate, you're not wrong. Many of the self-styled progressive advocacy groups in Washington that posture as hashtag resistance leaders turned a blind eye to the bill's problems and endorsed the legislation shortly after it was introduced, undercutting progressive lawmakers right off the bat. Yes, that was disgusting. The actions, of Move On, were disgusting in that instance. Making matters worse was the theater on the House floor. During a debate over the Democratic bill, 9 progressive lawmakers made a public show of voting against the procedural measure to advance the bill, along with a tiny group of moderates. When it came to the real vote on actually passing the bill, a larger group of moderates ended up voting against it, but only one progressive lawmaker, Representative Pramila Jayapal, voted no. AOC didn't vote no. Ilhan didn't vote no. Rashida didn't vote no. Ayanna didn't vote no. Ro Khanna didn't vote no. Only Pramila Jayapal voted no. Had the progressives and moderates combined forces on either of the votes, they would have forced the bill back to the drawing board. Instead, their shenanigans ultimately helped secure the legislation's passage. Taken together, the spectacle was more confirmation that whatever resistance exists in the nation's capital, it is so often performance art rather than anything real. In 2009, 2008, we used to call it kabuki, Washington kabuki. Quote, outside groups and House lawmakers need to work together to build a populist bloc, probably inclusive of moderate Democrats and perhaps even an occasional Republican who will stand united to force votes to ensure that our economy does right by ordinary people, said David Segal of Demand Progress, pointing to news of a potential Democratic coalition to buck the party's leadership and support a plan to float businesses' payrolls through the crisis. Quote, we must make sure that America does not go in the wrong direction and become even more inequitable because we let unemployment soar, compel cities and states to implement austerity, force small businesses to shutter, and let large corporations backstopped by the Fed by roll them up. The tragedy is that we're already moving in that wrong direction, as chances to change the political dynamic do not come around often. As Barack Obama's former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, now an investment banker and TV talking head, said more than a decade ago during the financial crisis, quote, "Never allow a good crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do the things you once thought were impossible," unquote. And here we have to interject that during the last few days, guess who Joe Biden has been talking to? And guess who is likely to be one of his advisors upcoming, maybe through the campaign and maybe but during the administration? It's the aforementioned Rahm. Remember, he's just had serious conferences with Larry Summers, and now he's turning to one of the other key members of that great old team that turned over the economy more and more to the neoliberals in the aftermath of the recession, the famous Rahm Emanuel, who was one of the lousiest mayors in the history of Chicago, who covered himself with vainglory since his stint in the White House as the chief of staff. If Joe Biden's been talking to Rahm, then the prospects are not very good for Joe Biden to become the new FDR, as he indicated, the closest thing to FDR, or whatever expression he used to claim that his was going to be the most progressive administration since the administration of FDR. Not with Rahm Emanuel anywhere near it. Not with Larry Summers anywhere near it. And David Sirota finishes. Billionaires and corporations are clearly following that advice. Nancy Pelosi is clearly following that advice, aiming to use the pandemic to grow their wealth and political power in previously unfathomable ways. Because Nancy Pelosi was using her political power in previously unfathomable ways. Until very recently, she was running the House completely. The House wasn't in session. She was in Washington, constructing the HEROES Act by herself, without consultation with very many of the caucus. Completely disempowering all those House Democrats who'd voted for her to become the Speaker, not giving them a say in the HEROES Act, and then presenting them with the bill to be voted on. And what was it, 4 days before the passage of the bill, an 1,815-page bill they were supposed to absorb in 4 days, with all the ins and outs and giveaways to neoliberal donors? That is something that could only have come in the midst of a pandemic crisis. It's the only way she could have done that. She used that to good effect to pass her message bill, to tell the donors, I'm on your side. I don't really care if I don't do anything important for the people. I'm on your side. Anyway, to repeat, billionaires and corporations are clearly following that advice, aiming to use the pandemic to grow their wealth and political power in previously unfathomable ways. It would be better if the opposition party put up a real fight, or at least refuse to be complicit in postponing progress for yet another generation. I thought that was an excellent piece by David. Of course, I had some commentary on it, but I thought that was an excellent piece. And it shows how counter the House is running against what real progressives like Rowan Gray and Nathan Tankus and others of us want to do right now, how we want to cope with the pandemic. We basically have no say right now, and we will not get any say until the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party stands on their hind legs, combined with whatever moderates and right wingers will go along with it, and says no to the establishment, says no to Pelosi and to McConnell, and says, no, you get absolutely nothing more until you have taken care of the people. And here are the bills that will take care of the people. You pass those first, or you're not going to be in leadership again. And by the way, you pass those first, or you're not getting any other help again. If the corporations get into any more trouble in the next few months, and you can bet, folks, they're going to, you don't get a bit of help from us until you ensure that the people and the business structure of this economy survive. That's what needs to be done, folks. So, that's my message for tonight. And now I'm going to turn attention to your comments. And Mark says, hello, Joseph. Hello, friends. Hi, I'm Mark. Nice to see you. Yep. Stacy says, Chief Prosecutor Amy Klobuchar dismissed charges against the... Is this... that she dismissed the charges against the cop who killed George Floyd? Is that right? I hope that's right, because that should take her out of consideration for the vice presidency. And Tim Canova says, I'm well, great to see you. After he talked about the countervailing power, yeah, it was great to see him. I hope he's still here. Stacy says, I'm good. I'm mad about a lot of things. Yeah, me too. But I'm perpetually mad about a lot of things. So what else is new? But I think I'm mad about all the right things, and I stay mad about the right things. Charles says, good evening, Dr. Joe and everyone. Kay says, I found out today Chris Hedges is running for Congress on the Green Party ticket. I think he's from New York, but I'm not sure on that. I'm not sure he's still okay in New York. He's down here a lot of the time. I can never tell whether he's located in New York or whether he's located here. Stacy says the New Jersey 12th. Steve says Princeton, New Jersey. Kay says, okay, I wasn't sure where he was from. Thank you for the info. He's running in the New Jersey 12th? Oh, that would be wonderful to get him in the New Jersey 12th. Charles says, well put, Dr. Joe. Sanders dropped out way too early. That's right. We'll never go back to the corporate Democrats. Steve says, hi, Tim Canova. Steve says, hi, Matt. Steve says, some heavy hitters here tonight. Bonnie says, the sound is great. Steve says, Matt Steck. Oh, hi, Matt Steck. Steve says, if the Sora sound wasn't great, we're a great bunch of complainers. Kay says, he's gone already, Steve. And Stacy says, there's plenty of virus fallout that will never be compensated. Stacy says, Umair Haque thinks we're going to annihilate. Anyway, I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Stephanie says, sorry I'm late. Hey, guys. Hi, Steph. How are you? Kay says, hi, Stephanie. And Stephanie says, okie dokie, share to all my groups. Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Charles says, good evening, Stephanie. Stephanie says, hey, Charles. Evelina says, and decapitated. Stephanie says, was just checking to make sure admins were approving. Kay says the oligarchy is killing us all. Kay says the power holders don't give a damn about the 99%. Julie Pulley says, hi, Joseph. Hi, Steve. Stacy says, it's the crisis of mean, stupid people. Nancy says, I should have said, hi, Julie. And also actually welcome, Julie, because I don't recognize that you've been here before, but you are very welcome. Stacy says it's the crisis of mean, stupid people. Evelina says, I assume you're listening. Laugh out loud. Hi. Kay says, people will just blow it off and stay home from voting, I'm afraid. What good did it do in 2018? It did some good. It got us some voices in Congress. They still haven't been successful, but it got us more voices in Congress and some pretty bold ones. It takes more than one election to get it done. We have to keep at it. We have to vote for the good ones, whether they're in the Democratic Party or whether they're not in the Democratic Party. Okay, now the day will come when we'll have to pressure them to get out of the Democratic Party. Okay, if the Democratic Party keeps on sabotaging them, okay, and us. But in the meantime, if the best people are running within the Democratic primary, we have to vote for them in that primary. Kay says, yep, I think people will vote for him in the primary. And Evelina says, who else? And Kay says, I was thinking about the November vote. And Kay says, I hope people will at least vote down ballot progressives in November. I hope so too. And Steve says, protesters are shutting down streets in downtown LA as we speak. How come, Steve? What's that protest about? Kay says, I saw that a while ago, Steve. Good for them. Steve says, news and pig helicopters everywhere. I'm watching out my window. Kay says, wow. And Evelina says, Cobra in Spanish means receive payment. Laugh out loud. Kay says, yes, pay go must go now. And Evelina says, Boutar, not boutique ice cream. Steve Day says, no pay go. Steve Wolfbrand said, or cost. Charles Brooks Lovett says, but the rigging system by the state Democrat parties is Pelosi's ace card. I damn sure hope that she is ousted. It is ace card. I hope that Shahed has a legal team and plenty of money to challenge the vote because they're going to rig that vote. It's California, and they can rig the machines. They can. And Kay says, Pramila was interviewed by Lauren Steiner today. Good interview. She did an interview on the robust opposition, Lauren Steiner's show an hour ago. Very interesting. Steve Day says, I'd like to see that. Charles Brooks Lovin says, frozen? I don't think I'm frozen. Kay says, supposed to be on YouTube tonight, L. Stephen Day. Stacy says, facebook.com, lauren.steiner, LA videos. Steve says, she's my friend. I've been to her house. Stacy says, Lauren's house looks amazing. The helicopters over LA are like hornets right now. And Stephen Day says, okay, is it SIP monitoring? Steve says, Stephen Wolfbrand says, SIP. And Stephen Day says, sorry, stay in place, SIP. Steve Wolfbrand says, not really, people are pissed. George Floyd protests in downtown LA now, blocking streets. George Floyd protests have spread to LA. Great. That is wonderful. I believe I'll be talking about George Floyd tomorrow night. I've been learning more and more about that, so I'll probably be giving that some coverage tomorrow night. That's what I expect, okay, in any case. Well, I've gone through your comments, and I want to thank you for being here. I want to remind you of my YouTube channel. Please remember my Patreon link at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. If you have any more comments, I will entertain those for a while longer. And Dolores says, thank you and good night. She probably wants to get to the George Floyd protests in downtown LA now. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for sharing. And thank you very much for all your support. Oh, she's got some Z's up there. Must be wanting to go to bed early tonight. Okay, any other comments? If not, I'm going to end the broadcast. Evelina says thank you for tonight. Kay says thank you, Joe, and all the rest for giving me a place to go to try to gain some sanity in this mess. I hope that's what we're gaining, Kay. We're trying awfully hard to keep our sanity in this mess. And by the way, keep safe. Keep safe. When you go out, gloves and masks. Steve says the Convo Couch live streamed the protest. Now, I was watching Pasta and Fee earlier tonight in two of their earlier streams, or this afternoon actually. I thought they were quite good today. They're always very good on voting irregularities. Very good on voting irregularities. I think they are unequaled on voting irregularities, except for her, perhaps for Tim. Okay, thank you again. I'm going to say good night. I'm ending the broadcast. Thanks. Oops. We got something else. Rick Maynard taking on Pelosi with Pramila Jayapal, co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, talked about a challenge to Pelosi the other week on the HEROES Act, her aligning with some of the GOP members against Nancy Pelosi on the FISA Act, whether the CPC needs to be smaller to be more effective, how activists on the outside can support the progressive legislators on the inside, and more. Sounds like a great stream. I've seen a lot of Lauren's streams. I agree, she does great streams. I just think she shouldn't be doing them from her bedroom. That's all. I've seen one or two streams from her bedroom. I think that, may be a certain kind of chic right now, but I'd rather have it come from the library anyway. Or in my case, my combination dining room, library, and storage center for my wife's activities in jewelry making. Bonnie is a jewelry designer. She designs and creates really beautiful necklaces. Anyway, good night again.